Welcoming you to this webinar on our flagship report, Working Across Scales, Learning from 7 Years of Climate Compatible Development in Asia. The main author of this report, Dr. John Colvin, who's one of the directors of the Emerald Network, is going to be our main presenter, and it would be my privilege to moderate this session. I hope you have already seen this report that was uploaded on the web. As for the agenda of this webinar, John would speak for about 35 minutes, after which we'll open the floor for questions, clarifications, and more importantly, reflections especially from people who have participated in these in some of these projects. Without further ado, over to John.
Thanks very much, Hassan. Apologies, everybody, that we're starting late, but I'd like to start by thanking CDKN for hosting this webinar, and especially CDKN Asia for inviting Emerald Network to undertake this work with them. And last but not least, thanks to you, the participants, for staying online and for joining us in this webinar. So what I'm going to be talking about is based on work undertaken by myself and Christina McDonough earlier this year. My colleagues Majabina Bidi Habib and Miriam Kogeli also looked at CDKN's work in regional networks, but we're not going to be speaking about this today. But those two pieces of work were connected in interesting ways. So the focus of this webinar is on working across scales and learning about ways of working across scales in the climate compatible development space based on 7 years of initiative and very interesting effort by CDKN in Asia. And what I want to cover in the next 35 minutes, I want to give you a bit of background on the context and the purpose and the methods of this work. And then the main focus will be on my reflections on 3 different kinds of pathways that I observed, pathways for working with scale. I also looked at the design principles that support this work, but it's unlikely that we'll be able to cover those today. So coming on first of all to the slide, next slide, which is about context, purpose and methods, and slide 4. So this issue of scale, I think, is a very critical issue in development and also in climate compatible development, because the way that things happen, the way that programs are implemented, the way that climate compatible development can proceed is very much embedded in different scales of action, different scales of governance. And this slide shows the interlinkages between global actors, national actors, and local actors, whether those are within communities or at a city, town, county, state, or province level. And in this webinar, we're going to be focusing on the linkages between the national level downwards or the community level upwards. And there are many different kinds of flows between these levels of authority, of engagement, of influence, of knowledge, of finance. This is what's sometimes called in the literature vertical governance, but I'm not going to be using the language of governance in this webinar. I'm going to be talking about linkages between scales of understanding and action. So, for example, what happens at a local level often relies on national support, for example, in finance or policy, or not just on national support, but on support from provinces, intermediate levels like districts and so on. But equally, national level or the state level relies on local actors to implement. So these different levels are very much interconnected. Now, this work builds on an earlier piece of work by CDKN in a partnership with ICLE, which was called a subnational learning partnership. And that work was very much involved in trying to understand the strategies and measures to enable effective climate-compatible development at these different subnational levels. But it mainly focused on local action and how that might be scaled up or out. So this is very much in keeping with the literature on community-based adaptation and on local level climate compatible development, and asking how scale up and scale out happens. And that was left as a question hanging in the report of that project, which came out in 2014. How can we understand better about how to work at scales which create impact through linking these scales? So that became the focus for this piece of work, and it also built in a recommendation of the end-of-year evaluation for 2016 that we should be looking, or there might be real value in looking at how CDKN has worked with these issues, multi-scale issues in Asia. So if we go to slide 5, we can consider CDKN's work in Asia, and particularly in its deep engagement countries, as a 7-year experiment in designing for working with multiple scales. And that gives us 2 questions. And I'm going to be focusing on the first of these in this talk. How can programs be designed to deliver climate compatible development benefits at scale, including but not limited to the scaling of approaches initially piloted locally, and what design principles might underpin that work? So coming on to approach, slide 6. We were asked to do a rapid learning review. Now, what does this mean? In our early inception work with CDKN Asia, we were asked to develop a learning framework supported by learning questions and a methodology and methods that might help us progress the learning review. In practice, actually, there were quite limited opportunities for designing learning spaces in this project. For example, we had no opportunities for face-to-face reflection. But I think importantly, through conversational interviews remotely by Skype, there was a space for reflection, at least, with those we interviewed, even though we weren't particularly able to follow those reflections up very much. So I think what I would like to say about this piece of work as a learning review is that the various reports and products that we produced, and this is one of those, they offer insights and the potential for learning which might come out of this webinar. So this isn't about lessons learned. It's about a series of nested stories designed to stimulate reflection and conversation and possible learning. Next slide. So we did, as part of our methodology, consider a number of learning questions, and I don't want to take you through all of these, but just maybe to pick out 2 or 3 which were critical to this, to the focus of this report. We wanted to understand, number 1, how subnational work unfolded in each of the 4 countries we ended up looking at. Number 4, we wanted to learn about the potential for working with scale and how this happens, and also how this work led to enhanced capability for whom and under what conditions. Next slide. So what we actually did was we focused mainly on document analysis and a series of email conversations and telephone or Skype interviews. And there was some limited space for feedback on our products, and all quotes were validated. But I think what's important to say about the way we approached this was that we used an appreciative and inquiring approach designed to encourage reflection in the interviews, and particularly to surface tacit as well as explicit knowledge. And what I mean by that is helping people to articulate through reflection what actually happened, how things happened, why things happened. So helping them to go deeper and to put into words their story of how projects developed and flowed, or flowed from one project to another, or perhaps didn't flow forward. And here we drew on elements of learning history, and the overall approach was iterative, reflexive, adaptive, and in parts emergent. So just to finish this section on methodology, I want to talk about our sampling, because that was quite important. Next slide, please. We started with a full database of 72 CDKN projects carried out in 5 what were called deep engagement countries: Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Nepal, and Pakistan, over a 7-year period. And from those we selected 36 with a subnational component, which means a focus on one or more levels below the national level, although it could include work nationally. And then from these we selected 21 projects for more detailed inquiry, based on a number of criteria, and then out of those 21 projects we constructed 10 stories as the focus for this report, and those stories were, many of them were supported by more than one project. So coming on to the next slide, number 10, this shows the 10 stories that we are reporting on, 2 in Indonesia, 2 in Pakistan, 2 in Nepal, and 4 in India. And you'll see that in Pakistan and Nepal, the stories start quite late on in the 7-year period, and this is partly because the work undertaken at a national level preceding these was actually quite important for the emergence of these initiatives. Whereas in India, for example, perhaps because of the entry at state level, these stories or initiatives made up of, in most cases, multiple projects emerged much earlier. So I'm going to be talking about 6 of these over the next 15 minutes. Next slide, please. And I'm going to be arguing that effective design is key to working with scale, and that we can understand how to do this through looking at pathways for working with scale, which is really the stories of how CDKN worked on sequencing and linkages of activities across a number of different levels of scale, and then the principles for supporting that work. So as I say, let's focus on those pathways first. Coming on to slide number 13, the next one after this. What our inquiry, sorry, if you can go back to slide 13. Thank you. What our inquiry revealed were that those 10 pathways broadly fell into 3 categories. There were a number of projects, 2 that we looked at, which essentially illustrated short-term multi-scale pathways that were research-led and succeeded in building awareness of climate-compatible development, but actually fell short of embedding any new practices. Then there was an intermediate category, short-term multi-scale pathways, that adopted a hybrid approach, mixing action research and research from the outset, and as a result succeeding in embedding new practices at some scales, often locally, but not at others. And then there were 3 projects that essentially involved longer-term multi-scale pathways that took an action research-led approach across the different scales and succeeded in embedding new practices at multiple scales. So these are pathways that we're observing in retrospect, and they're actually a mix of planned and emergent design approaches. And this is what this experiment in design over 7 years reveals. So let's come and look at the first set of those. There are 2 examples of these short-term research-led multi-scale pathways. And the first one was in Indonesia, where CDKN was seeking to support, develop a supported NAMA in the province of West Nusa Tenggara. And this was based around a 14-month study to explore the institutional challenges and potential solutions to developing a supported NAMA. And the main aim was to design a set of policy measures that would support the emergence of independent power producers and promote independent power producer investment in small and medium-sized electricity generation schemes from renewable energy sources. And this project, which was supported by the National Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, drew on 2 provincial to local case studies, and it led to a set of policy recommendations submitted to the Ministry to inform a NAMA concept. Now, what we observed in this admittedly quite short project was that despite the quality of the multi-level institutional analysis produced by the research, which initially engaged the interest of the Ministry, 3 years after completion of this study, there's been no decision to invest in the NAMA concept, and the Ministry's interest has shifted away from NAMAs and towards energy conservation. So as national policy changes were critical, if local level investment was to proceed, the project also led to little change on the ground. And I think this reveals the limitations of this relatively brief research-led approach to low carbon transition in the context of Indonesia's energy political economy. Next slide, please. So here's a reflection from the country engagement lead, Muhammad Indrawan in Indonesia. In my view, the ministry is less interested in NAMAs compared to energy conservation. I would conclude that the concepts are all excellent and the technical assistance probably well appreciated. However, to be effective, there needed to be proper involvement of the ministry as service recipient from the very beginning and at all stages. So this issue, I suppose, that's being raised here is how do you develop good buy-in, and is the research approach sufficient, or is a more action research approach needed? Next slide, please. So in the second example of these short-term research-led approaches, this comes from Nepal. Quite a recent piece of work, and the focus was on increasing the resilience of irrigation systems in Nepal. 2 catchments in the western region of the country were selected for in-depth study over 2 years, with collection of data on the performance and management of small and medium-sized irrigation systems. The purpose was to inform future national policy and regulatory decisions within the Ministry of Irrigation and to provide guidance on future investment. And what this research did do was it succeeded in supporting the development of new thinking at national level, but perhaps because the project finished only recently, it's too early to see how this will be applied in practice. And I think what's particularly interesting about this piece of work are the challenges encountered in the study between the quality of local findings and how to bridge from these into an approach to scaling across the whole country. So these issues of scaling came up through the research process, and we see on the next slide a reflection, slide 17 please. We see a reflection from the project manager Simon House from Mott MacDonald, who's saying, I think it was relatively easy working at an individual scheme level to see what the problems were there and to come up with some recommendations. But generalizing and coming up with guidance for the department was quite tricky. You want to do something small and then scale up quickly. It applies on almost every project, not just this one. And with limited resources, it's particularly difficult. So I think here we're seeing some of the technical challenges of generalizing from local cases across a broader scale with very many different contexts. And so if we come to just reflect on these 2 case studies in slide 18, what we can see is that both of these initiatives, while developing new awareness among national policymakers and no doubt also among provincial, district and more local actors, they have yet to demonstrate impact in terms of changes in individual or institutional practices. In the Indonesian case, the probability of impact after 3 years appears to be much reduced, although further research into unintended impacts may reveal as yet little understood pathways. Whereas in the Nepal case, it's probably too early to comment on potential changes in practice. So our reflection on these 2 cases is that to what extent are these more traditional linear research-led approaches able to yield any significant changes in climate-compatible development practice in the context of relatively short-term investments, maximum 2 years? And also in the light of the significant challenges of instituting change across differences of scale from the national to the local. I mean, this is really a difficult nut to crack, and the question we're asking across these different case studies is, how do you do this work, and what kind of knowledge practices can make that difference? So let's come on then in the next slide to look at the next cluster of pathways. And actually there were 4 cases that we looked at here, one in Indonesia, one in India, but here in this webinar I'm just going to reflect on another case from Nepal and this case from Pakistan, which was focusing on developing renewable energy solutions in Sialkot city, which is situated within one of Pakistan's industrial hubs. And the objective was to shift from diesel generators, which are very vulnerable to load shedding, and therefore have an impact on business, to renewables. And during the work, rooftop photovoltaics were assessed as the best option. And this pathway emerged in 2 phases. So it was about 2 projects. And the first was designed around the possibility of a NAMA-led assessment And despite the complexity of working across different sectors and levels of governance, from federal through provincial to the CLCOT city level, significant advances were made in building understanding and ownership of a NAMA recommendation. Yet at the same time, the Federal Ministry of Climate Change was cautious about commitment to this NAMA option. So I think what happens in the second phase of this work is interesting because other potential investors came to the table. And to increase the chances of investment, the project made a move towards a subtle reframing. So seeing this work not just exclusively as a NAMA, but that it might be funded in a different way, not just as a NAMA. And this opened the door for funders such as the State Bank of Pakistan and the Asian Development Bank to come in. And the Alternative Energy Development Board at the federal level also got involved. And as a result, the outline shape of a partnership, willing and able together to agree a suitable investment model, was progressed significantly. So what we see in this case study, next slide please, slide 20, here's a reflection by the project manager, Juan Osornio from Ecofis. This is a very important nuance from the first year to the second year, where we deliberately decided not to label this as a NAMA because we wanted to increase the likelihood of the actual solar panels being bought. So we said, we'll develop a project that could be financed as a NAMA, but it could be financed as a different model. And that opens up the chance to say, you could do it through a NAMA, or you could do it through a traditional development assistance or with private funding. Okay, the next example in this category of short-term multi-scale pathways that adopt a hybrid action and research approach comes again from Nepal. And in this piece of work, the focus was on developing a climate-smart agriculture approach, and it was designed to help the Ministry of Agriculture and Development develop a model of climate-smart agriculture which could be taken to scale. And this piece of work, which was actually, I think, commissioned as a single project, it took an innovative design approach, generating insights and learning through three action research projects at a local level, one in each of 3 agroecological regions. So what you're seeing here is you're seeing at a local level an action research approach, and then at a national level a more research, traditional research focus. The challenge was to try and use the insights and the emerging action generated from the local work to support ministry staff in understanding what climate-smart agriculture might mean in practice and how to implement this at scale. So the main design considerations concern the relationship between learning within and across the 3 local pilots and learning at the national level, including from the pilots. And if we look at the next slide, slide 22, which is a reflection by Dr. Bikash Paudel, the project manager, he's really reflecting on this relationship between the local action research and what is happening nationally, and how the learning is happening between a consortium of different ministries brought together in a review panel. So he's saying one approach might have been to develop scaling up strategies without piloting, but we felt that field-based evidence was important so that we could learn about barriers to adoption. We also knew that government actions often lack richness. For example, 80% of farmers are never reached by government. So this was another reason for field-based evidence. On the other hand, linking the local pilots to the national level, as in the other previous Nepal project, was a daunting task. And the way they addressed this was through a modelling approach. And this helped us to extrapolate the local work to the national scale using a recommendation domain map, which recommends how scaling can be done. So next slide, please. If we now reflect on these 2 examples of a hybrid approach, what we see is that each initiative succeeded in going beyond awareness raising to progressing new practices, or at least new institutional capital, either at a local or at a national level. So in this climate-smart agriculture work in Nepal, which blended action research on the ground, we saw significant developments in new practices because it built new skills and capabilities for farmers. extension workers and planners, for example, training farmers on zero tillage and other climate-smart agriculture technologies, and combine this with a research approach at a national level which built new understanding and relational cross-ministerial capital, even though this understanding and insight has yet to be implemented. Whereas in Pakistan, the local participatory research in Sialkot significantly advanced understanding and ownership of a renewable energy investment solution based on solar PV, although this has yet to be implemented. Whereas in this example, the more action-oriented research approach at the national level combined further feasibility study with an active search for a viable combination of organizations willing and able to agree a suitable investment model. And this has, at a minimum, progressed the outline of shape of such a partnership, although agreement of that partnership is still in process. Okay, so if we come to the next slide, I want to come on to the final pair of examples. And these are examples of pathways that unfold over a much longer term, on average at least, I think it's three and a half to 4.5 years. And what we see in these examples is that an action research approach underpins the whole pathway. Both examples come from India, and this first example is of mainstreaming climate change into disaster and state disaster management plans. And this initiative, and it's interesting here, in contrast to some of the other examples we've been looking at, this initiative actually starts locally and then proceeds through a process of scaling up and out. So it starts in the district of Gorakhpur in Uttar Pradesh, and then it subsequently scales out to 2 other district state systems. And this is a scaling pathway that was mainly emergent rather than being planned and present in the original design. So there are a number of phases, and during the first 18-month phase of work, the focus is on embedding understanding of climate-related vulnerabilities and uncertainties and their impact on systems such as water supply, health, power, housing and agriculture across the relevant line departments within the Gorakhpur district government. And I think an important feature of this work is a shared learning dialogue approach, which was used to build cross-departmental cooperation and ownership and understanding of a more proactive approach to disaster management, which then gets translated into policy in the form of Gorakhpur's Climate Smart District Disaster Management Plan published in 2013. So what we're seeing is early engagement and early action in the form of the publication of this disaster management plan. And then there's a second step to this scaling process, when the findings of the district level process are used to promote shared learning dialogues at the state level. So we start to see a scaling up. And then what happens is, and this is significant, is the Uttar Pradesh state government then writes to all 75 districts in the state, directing them to follow the process taken by Gorakhpur. Next slide, please. Then a third, more emergent scaling out process takes place as a result of the development of a training manual, which the National Institute of Disaster Management then uses to provide training to district authorities from across India. So we're seeing a new way of thinking and developing disaster management plans, moving from a district to a state, and then scaling out to other district authorities across India. And then in the final stage of this scaling process, the approach developed and the learning from Gorakhpur and Uttar Pradesh is taken out to 2 new states, Odisha and Uttarakhand, in an intentional way. And this is facilitated in part by the involvement of individuals from key districts in those 2 new states in the national training program. And this scaling out work then leads to the completion of revised district disaster management plans in both districts. So I think we're seeing a very interesting pathway of scaling up and out across this case. And while the overall success of this initiative can be attributed to several factors, it seems to us that taking an action research approach linked with a flexible and emergent approach to design appear to have been key. Moving on to slide 26. This is our last example, and this is from work over 4.5 years on heat health action in urban India. And this work emerges and develops out of a response to the deadly heat wave that hit Ahmedabad in Gujarat in May 2010. And the focus in the early phase of work was on the development of a heat wave action plan for Ahmedabad, which was launched in April 2013. And while this phase saw the development of strong local ownership and momentum, I think what's interesting is there's also early engagement of two important national actors, the Indian Met Department and the National Disaster Management Authority, which reflects an early design emphasis by the project team on multi-level engagement. And then what happens is in the second phase of this pathway, which starts in 2014, we see very rapid scaling with heat wave management plans currently under development or improvement in 14 cities across 5 states. So I think this moment in this pathway is a really interesting one, because what happens to stimulate this is that the CDKN project brings together champions from 5 states and from several cities across those states in a workshop, a 3-day workshop, to look at what's been learned from Ahmedabad. And then what happens, because of the excitement and interest of those attending, they take up the process. And so the process becomes self-organizing, with many of those champions going on ahead to develop heat action plans, in some cases city-led, in other cases state-led, or in some cases jointly state and city-led. This took the CDKN project quite by surprise, and while they were excited, they had to think fast on their feet about how to support this self-organizing scaling process. And what they did was to provide targeted support from the supplier team to help support the rapid progression and unfolding of these pathways. And next slide, please. In the final stage of this story, what we see in 2016 is the development of a roadmap, a national roadmap for planning for heatwave management in India. So overall, this story, we think, highlights the need to invest adequate time if scaling is to be achieved successfully, but building on early successes. And the experience from this case was that promising solutions found through piloting in one place can be spread quite rapidly if the right conditions are in place, but that it can take time before these enabling conditions come together in a tipping point. And then following this tipping point, processes of learning and adapting were rapid because they were primarily self-organizing, taking the principles of what was working in Ahmedabad and testing them out in other places and political contexts. So if we come to slide 28, which I think is my last slide, this is really now reflecting overall on what we see coming out of these 3 different pathways and of this 7-year experiment. What is the value of getting into action early, even where we're trying to work at multiple scales and multiple scales are involved? And if we reflect on and compare and contrast these 3 different approaches, so starting with, first of all, with the research-led approach, which we saw in West Nusa Tenggara in Indonesia, and with the Nepal irrigation work, this, we think, reflects the assumption that the purpose of research is to inform changes in awareness and understanding, and then over time, these translate into changes in practice. So this is quite a traditional research-led model, or if you like, theory of change, although I haven't used theory of change discourse in this report. But the question is, in the context of relatively short-term investments, the translation of changes in awareness and understanding into changes in practice doesn't happen. And this may be because there isn't sufficient buy-in and energy created through the awareness-raising process. Or it may be in some cases that there was simply no more funding available. Whereas by contrast, in the pathway 3 or pathway C, the longer-term action research-led approach, this has a different set of assumptions underpinning it, and therefore a different theory of change. And that is about a different model of learning by doing, in which changes in understanding, in relationships and practice are interdependent. And in all of these cases, what we saw were changes in practice at multiple levels of governance or at multiple scales. And then we have these in-between hybrid examples where you have action research at some level and a more traditional research approach at another level. And it seems that these potentially have they have stronger potential for multi-scale action if further funding had been available. They all showed changes in practice at one level, mainly local, but with significant development of relational capital to other levels. Our conclusion is that there is, however, no right approach, because, of course, what works will depend on culture and political economy. But in principle, these hybrid approaches, which may be more appropriate in some cultural or political economy settings, nonetheless at the same time highlight the value of getting into action early and at multiple scales, and with the potential to lead to change at multiple scales. So I'm going to stop there. I think I've gone well over my 35 minutes, and let's take some time for reflections. And although I'm happy to answer questions, it'd be quite nice to switch from expert and teacher mode and simply to hear your own reflections and resonances. What does this mean for you, and what did you find particularly resonant for you? Thank you.
Thank you, John. This is Hassan Rizvi. Since we have not received any request for question or comments, could I request you to please continue with some of the design principles that you have derived based on this experience? And maybe we can take the reflections and questions later on. And by the way, you're well within your time. Thank you for that.
I see. So we're going on till 11:15, is that correct? Or are we going on for another 20 minutes?
Maybe a few minutes before that. So so that we can take at least a couple of questions or comments at least.
So I don't know how many people I've been speaking to. I have no idea of the size of the participants in this webinar, or the number
20,
of participants.
About 20.
20. Well, you know, in some ways, I'd really like to create the space for reflection without, and encourage people just to speak about what's resonating with them or what's intriguing them.
John,
rather than just kind of steamroller on. I'd really like to get some feedback.
I understand and appreciate that, and so we have an intervention request, and I would give over the mic to Sam for his reflection on this experience.
Yeah, Hassan and John, this is Sam Bickersteth speaking from Oxford today, and thank you very much for a really lovely presentation. Of course, I love all these projects, and I've worked with CDKN and the CDKN Asia team throughout this entire period, so recognize the stories that you tell and applaud the challenge of pulling a pattern out of this, and I completely agree with many of your conclusions. I think your last sort of point was, well, there's no right or wrong here, is quite important. I mean, back in 2010, there was a lot of interest in NAMAs. And if you look at your triangle at the beginning, the entry point for the conversation, which probably took us to the islands of Indonesia, was that NAMA. And I think the nice thing in Sialkot was saying, hey, we've got to kind of break this and stop talking about NAMAs, because the international entry point, that's the top of your triangle, isn't it, the global, can help, it can start you, but you need to move on from it. And clearly, we all know that working in this business, there are countless NAMAs that have been designed and only a handful that are actually being financed. So I think there are many entry points, and there's no right one and wrong one. I do think the design principles in the Gorakhpur project were particularly strong. Remember, there had been prior work there, so I think I would emphasize time frame and skill sets. There was a very good skill set in place there to really do action research from the beginning in partnership with the national and international partners there. And I think they really built on that beautifully. And the final thing I would say is time to come back is the issue. And of course, we had the time on that project, and we had the time and the continuity, the longer time frame on the heat health work, which has seen uptake beyond India, of course, in Pakistan as well, as I think many people on this call will know. But I heard just this last week how well this irrigation piece has gone in your very second case study. Really high levels of ownership by the ministry in Nepal, the Department of Irrigation, in that. And the work that the McDonald and the national team have done has really bedded in, and it is fully branded by the government of Nepal, which is fantastic. So I suppose my conclusion is there are many pathways. It is about an approach, and starting with a very inclusive ownership, action-oriented approach, and time really matters, I suppose. Those would be my two comments. Thank you very much, though, for a very interesting presentation.
John, would you like to respond to this?
No, yes, thanks, Sam, for your reflections. I really appreciate those and agree with your points, and keen to hear from others.
John, so far there are none. So
Okay.
could we please move on to the next part of your presentation?
Yes, of course. And this, I think, will build on some of Sam's points about skill sets and timeframes and so forth. So I want to talk about 5 design principles that we pulled out that we saw as supporting these pathways and helping them to be effective, whichever pathway was being pursued. And the first one we've already been talking about, which is about getting into action early, so I don't want to repeat that one, because that was we were taking that as the kind of lead pathway assumption and seeing how that played out. So let's skip. I think the next slide just speaks to that one again, slide 32. So I think we can you give me slide, so we've covered that, so let's go straight on to slide 33. This is an important one, and I think it links very closely to getting into action early, and it's a principle that actually came out from the CDKN ICLE work and their report on Close to Home, where they also emphasize the adaptive management approach. Because if you think about the transition from one project to another to create a longer-term pathway, or even inside some projects, the importance of being flexible and taking an adaptive management approach, which of course is integral to action research, came across to us very strongly. And here's just a couple of examples from 2 programs where we saw that adaptive management reflected particularly well. In the climate smart agriculture work in Nepal, adaptive management, I think, was in the blood of the project team as action researchers. But what was interesting there was that it was sometimes in tension with the CDKN and DFID log frame requirements, and I'm sure that many of you will be familiar with the tensions that can exist between the move we've seen over the last 5 years towards flexible and adaptive management, doing development differently, what's sometimes called PDIA from Harvard, the problem-driven iterative adaptive approach. They do raise questions about project management frames, and of course the whole debate about the relationship between log frames and theory of change comes into play here. Another example, and this was one that Sam was just pointing to, from Gorakhpur, where we had the shared learning dialogues approach. This was very much about a flexible approach to dialogues with multiple stakeholders, but it wasn't just about the project team. It was also about CDKN working flexibly with the project team, and I think this reflection from Shashikant Chhabda is a nice illustration of that. So he says, CDKN gave us a lot of space in terms of how to approach this project. For example, we worked together with CDKN to develop the concept note for phase 2 into full proposal. We sat together and worked on this. I know of very few other donors who take such an open and flexible approach. It was a rich experience. So just two examples that I do think that the flexibility and adaptability both of CDKN in Asia and of the project teams was critical to the success and the direction of the pathways that we've been looking at. Coming on to the next slide, 34. This is a design principle of extending where innovation is taking hold. I think it's a really interesting. Well, let me just say a bit more about how I understand this principle. It's about extending initial short-term project investments into longer-term pathways, but only in cases where innovation is taking hold in practice as well as in understanding. So this again very much supports getting into action early, generating energy, seeing if early awareness changes are translated into action and changes in institutional relationship that can support those, and then investing in in what's working and maybe not putting in more money into where things aren't taking hold. And this is actually a really important principle if we go to the theoretical literature on how to do learning and evaluation under what are called wicked or complex situations, because essentially in a wicked and complex landscape, the strategy is to invest in multiple experiments and to support those ones that are working. And so this is what you see CDKN in Asia doing here, effectively through these 10 experiments. But in order to do that, you have to have a funding model that allows you to do that. And here we see the strength of the CDKN funding model, because it meant that follow-on phases could be put in place relatively quickly, enabling further investment in emerging action pathways. And I think this raises actually quite significant questions about how we fund climate compatible development, particularly as the pot of green and CCD finance expands. And I think this is an important question and challenge to be putting to processes like the Green Climate Fund and others, where you're getting much more scaled up pots of money. How do you actually finance these flexible and adaptive management approaches? I think that's all I want to say about that. But just that last bullet point maybe reminding us that the trajectories of these more successful pathways, sometimes you have to wait, although there's early ownership and gain at one level, it may be that the breakthrough doesn't come for a while, in which you get the tipping point into scaling out and up. So again, the case for keeping the space open for longer-term pathways, but through a progressive and flexible funding model. Next one, please. Again, this is another point around flexibility, but a really interesting one around flexible points of entry. Because what we saw is that the CDKN model allowed these pathways to develop or emerge out of a whole range of different entry points. And again, if we think about complexity theory and how to do effective work in complex and wicked situations, we know from systems theory that start conditions matter. That's one of the things that kind of a very clear message that comes out of systems thinking. So having the flexibility of start conditions, flexible points of entry, I think was a real strength of the approach that CDKN was taking in Asia. And just to highlight some of the different entry points that these 10 examples built off. So first of all, they could be in a responsive mode. The sorry, to go back one point. Sorry, to stay on that slide. That was me reflecting out loud that I'd missed the first point, which is that while on the one hand a generic mix of commissioning approaches, CDKN Global took a generic mix of commissioning approaches, which included global and regional research calls and relationship building with targeted in-country partners, often in government, and on occasion supplier-led projects. Beneath that generic approach, what we're seeing is these flexible kinds of entries. So the first is responding to trigger events, and several of these projects were either initiated as a result of shocks, such as flash floods or extreme heat waves, or stresses, so the load shedding in Sialkot, and the recurring impacts of local flooding in Gorakhpur. We saw that projects could be initiated either through national policy or local priorities. So although these pathways are about working at multiple scales, the entry points could be local. So it could be about local pilots that scaled up, but it could equally be national, for example, with taking a NAMA entry point. So I think recognizing that as we expand our understanding of pathways for working at multiple levels of scale and their interactions, there's no one entry point. The interventions can be planned, but they can also be opportunistic, so being open to both those possibilities. And finally, and this is an important one, the importance of trust and established relationships were often key. And I know it sounds a bit like repeating the obvious, but it is important to remember, and particularly, for example, in Pakistan and in Nepal, both those subnational, those pairs of subnational examples came out of a really important pathway of relationship building at the national level. So they didn't just happen. They emerged out of 3 or 4 years of prior investment at a national level. And then the final slide, 36. Thank you. This picks up Sam's point about skill sets. And this, I think, is a good one to end on, and it picks up many of the points that have been made in various communications out of the close to home CDKN-ICLEI partnership. And of course it speaks to what CDKN has been all about, which as a knowledge network is about bringing together a range of knowledge brokering practices. And so it's not surprising, but it's important to highlight that these different cases drew on a rich and flexible toolkit of knowledge brokering and knowledge networking practices, with particular attention to knowledge bridging between sectors and between scales. Now, there's been a really significant development in the literature on knowledge brokering and knowledge networking and knowledge intermediation, and there's inevitably an expansion of language around that over the last 7 years. And so I didn't spend a lot of time trying to get the right categories, because there are lots of ways of speaking about this. But I think what we see underpinning these pathways, and a really rich legacy of CDKN's work, is what we've been learning about doing good knowledge networking, good knowledge brokering across scales. And it involves all sorts of different approaches and supporting tools. So obviously building understanding of climate compatible development, developing and drawing on tools for translation and making what can be quite complex conceptual frameworks accessible, but also bridging across different ways of understanding climate compatible development. So linking community understanding and community knowledge and frameworks with district discourses within district government, and how those are articulated to include understandings of climate vulnerability and climate compatible development. So the skills are bridging across different ways of understanding. Facilitating effective participatory processes, yes, again, that's almost stating the obvious, but it is very important to remind ourselves of that, and that was something that was highlighted in the Close to Home report a couple of years ago. Action-oriented knowledge, thinking about what is knowledge and how are different forms of knowing connected to practice and action, and the shared learning dialogues are a good example of a tool to support that approach. But another example is how the climate smart agriculture work in Nepal involves stakeholders and data collection. And then finally, the importance of knowledge brokering for working with scale, knowledge bridging across scales. And a model that was used a lot in the different examples we've been talking about are pulling together consortia that combine local, national, and international knowledge, experience, and connections. So it's actually within those consortia and through those consortia embodying knowledge bridging that you then can support knowledge bridging in the work that you're doing. So I'm going to stop there, and it would be good again to hear any resonances or reflections in the few minutes that we have left to us. Thank you.
John. And there is another request for a question from a member of the Asia team, Zunera Reis, and I'm giving the mic to her.
Yes, hi John.
Hi.
Hi. As everyone has said, it is a brilliantly executed work. What I wanted to ask was that you've worked with a lot of different entities who have been working in the same sector as CDKN in climate compatible development and sustainable development. What do you find is different in CDKN's operations, and what are your reflections on how these things could have been done better and with more efficacy?
Tough question.
No, thank you, Zena. That's a really, I really like that question. I want to answer it in two ways. So, you know, if we think about what I've just been discussing, these different design principles, what I wanted to highlight is that in many ways, CDKN was in a unique position to put into practice adaptive, flexible ways of working, combining research and action research. As a knowledge network, it was able to build and encourage skill and capacity development around different forms of knowledge brokering. So that, you know, that has been part of its real strength, and playing to that advantage. But at the same time, thank goodness, CDKN isn't unique in that, and that there are others doing this. And I can think of, you know, various examples from around the world of other initiatives working in this way. So the question really is, how do we take these examples of what the PDIA literature would call positive deviance, examples of things that are working really well, or processes and programs that are learning really well? How do we take those? And I would include these examples from CDKN's work in Asia, but I can think of, for example, the work of the Adaptation Learning Program, DFID funded in 5 countries in Africa, the work of the African Climate Change and Resilience Alliance across 3 countries in Africa. How do we take these different examples and how do we maintain their profile and scale them up into these big, you know, large funding initiatives like the Green Climate Fund? And how do we make sure they're somehow scaled into those programs rather than getting lost? And I think that's part of our challenge now.
Thank you, John. We have 2 more questions or comments. Actually, one only. And it is by Mr. Ali Tawqir Sheikh, the director of the Asia program, CDKN. And I pass the mic to him.
Yes. Thank you, Hassan, and John, thank you very much for such a meaningful work and excellent presentation, summing up a work as diverse and as complex as we think it is. I think you and your colleagues have done a very good job. And we have worked together all along on these things. I just broader observation, especially to provoke some reaction from the outsiders and perhaps a little bit of reflection from you. In analyzing our work in three pathways, it's an internal loop of CDKN, how we design and implemented or carried out different projects. And that loop is complete in itself, about our methodology, about our teams, about our service providers, about our budgets, and the ways of working. I was just wondering if there is a particular reflection that you anyone else who has dialed in today can the government in mid-course the project was rehashed, redesigned, or we invented or innovated different ways of implementing or adding new objectives. How far that can be attributed to our way of working alone, and how far it is the maturity or evolution of thinking on part of those ministries and departments, people working there, sometimes because of transfers or sometimes because of the presence of their own learning of some of the projects. So it's just a broader comment to solicit some reaction. Thank you.
So, Hassan, should I answer?
Go ahead.
Ali, thank you very much for your question. Actually, the line wasn't very good, so most of your question I lost. But if I can summarize what I heard at the end, your question is how much of this, in reflecting on these opportunities for flexibility and adaptation and redesigning, a course correction through, say, a 4.5-year initiative. How much is it about CDKN's way of working, and how much is it about what goes on in ministries and departments? And of course, it's about both. And if I think of other cases where I've worked with similar dynamics or being worked alongside programs to reflect on similar kinds of dynamics. You know, if I can make a distinction between situations where it's just important to react and adapt because you've had a change of a significant individual, a minister, or a key champion, then of course you have to adapt, and it may set you back 8 months, but then you may bounce back and recover. So in that case, being flexible and adapting is critical just for keeping the initiative going. And that's different from actually starting to build in a more flexible and adaptive and learningful way of working within a ministry or across several departments, say in a district level government. And I think that latter is much harder to do. And I think is the challenge we face going forward is how to institute these kinds of flexible working practices in our, if I can put it this way, client systems, as well as within our own consortia and teams. I can think of examples. I can think of an example from Uganda and one in Ethiopia, where I've been working alongside different projects recently that have made some headway in terms of creating platforms for this kind of flexible and adaptive working. And if I think about an example from those cases that I've discussed, it may be that for example, the work in Nepal on the climate smart agriculture, where the consortium set up a a review panel across 7 ministries, that in itself was created an important opportunity for cross-departmental and cross-ministerial learning that those who were involved came to value. I think that's a good example of doing that kind of work, and I see that happening in recent DFID work in Ethiopia, for example. So I think these examples are quite important for us to recognize and to find ways of strengthening in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John. And I think it's now time to conclude this session. Our greatest thanks and appreciation to you, John, for not only the wonderful analytical work that you did on this flagship report, but also for this excellent presentation and co-reflection with us. And I would like to also thank all the colleagues who participated in this webinar. And for those who couldn't participate, there is a good news that the webinar has been recorded, and we'll share the link of this recording with all members of the CDKN team. Plus, we would like to invite you for further reflection if you have not been able to, say, directly intervene in the webinar, but if you have some questions, reflections, resonances, please share with us. And we'll share it with the whole team as well, because the prime purpose of this exercise was to have a shared learning among the CDKN team. Thank you once again. All the best.